Hi, second graders. The Chocolate Touch here. Chapter 8. English class passed without incident. Miss Plimsoll distributed word lists for her pupils to take home. The more words you know, she explained as always, the more exactly you can think. There were some difficult new words John noticed. Unhealthiness, moderation, digestive system. As Miss Plimsoll explained the meaning of each one, it seemed to John as though they all had a special bearing on his present uncomfortable situation. At last the bell rang. "Very well, class," Miss Plimsoll said. "Time for outside activities. Good afternoon." "Good afternoon, Miss Plimsoll." Miss Plimsoll gave the signal for dismissal, and the pupils in the front row filed out, followed by those in the second row, including John and Susan. John and Susan. Susan played a violin in the school orchestra, and usually she and John went to the rehearsals in the auditorium together. This time, Susan hurried on ahead of him. John followed very slowly. Think back, why was Susan mad at John? There was something going on between them. Do you remember? Something with the coin? The members of the orchestra were sitting at their music stands on the auditorium stage when John, carrying his dark blue trumpet case, got to his chair in the brass section. Mrs. Quaver had already begun to explain a difficult passage to the girl who played the flute. "Just after Jay sings 'Nestling, chirp, and flee,'" she was saying, "you come in with your do-dee-do-dee-do. Do you see the place on your score? Good." "Ah, John," Mrs. Quaver exclaimed, seeing him in his place. "I'm glad you're not absent. As I have just told the others, this afternoon we're having the first joint rehearsal of my arrangement of A Boy's Song by James Hogg. We've been over all the individual parts and all the sections you will recall. Now it's time to fit the pieces together." John nervously opened his trumpet case and took his shining golden trumpet from its bed of scarlet velvet. The beautiful new instrument gave him confidence. He worked the valves nimbly with his fingers and looked at Mrs. Quaver again. "Now, John," she said, "tell me when your little solo begins." Right after the end of the second verse, John promptly replied. He had practiced his part every evening in the basement at home for the last 2 weeks. He knew every note perfectly. After the line, "That's the way, Billy and me." "Good," Mrs. Quaver said. "And don't forget what I told you, John. This is a happy song. I want you to play ta-ta, ta-ta-ta, simply repeating the rhythm of the voice. And I want you to be light and lively. This is supposed to be the song of a boy who loves his country." Ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta, John thought. That shouldn't be too difficult, even with the whole orchestra listening to him. He had played it over and over again at home, but he would have to try extra hard here. This was to be his first solo. Everyone else was depending on him to play it properly. "Right," said Mrs. Quaver brightly. With his baton, she rapped twice sharply on the music stand before her. All the musicians brought their instruments into playing position. Susan poised her bow over the strings of her violin. John held his trumpet close to his mouth and wiggled his fingers on the valves. Mrs. Quaver's baton moved from side to side and then up and down. The cymbals clashed and the drums thumped. The piano brought his fingers down on the ivory keys of the piano. The violinists and the cellists made their wheeling and whumping sounds. All were in perfect unison. The rehearsal had begun. After the introduction, one of the older boys began to sing. After the last line of the first verse, John's fellow trumpeter echoed the rhythm of the singer's voice. Ta, 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 ta. Mrs. Quaver smiled approvingly at the successful performance. With her baton, gave the singer the signal to begin the second verse. "That's the way for Billy and me." John swallowed with an effort and put the mouthpiece of his trumpet to his lips for his solo. The mouthpiece instantly changed to chocolate. Then, almost as fast as the chocolate spread along the instrument, changing all the flashing gold into a dull brown. The first note came out fairly true, ta, but chocolate trumpets cannot withstand much pressure. The hole in the mouthpiece softened and clogged up, and the valves stuck as John desperately tried to finish his part. Mrs. Quaver's eyes almost popped out of her head as she listened to him play. Ta, ta, ta. It sounded as though John were trying to play a soap-filled bubble pipe. Terribly flustered, he put down his trumpet. Mrs. Quaver was speechless. The orchestra was rocked by a big, huge laughter. The other trumpeter leaned over towards John's chair and picked up the trumpet. "It's a chocolate trumpet," he shouted. No wonder it sounded like that. John Midas was trying to play a chocolate. John didn't wait to hear any more. He fled from the stage and out to the playground without stopping. Even to look around, he ran through the stone gateway and homeward. Chapter 9, we're getting towards the end. I'm just going to read chapter 9 too. Why not? Oh, the shame of it, the humiliation. John wept breathlessly as he ran, shocked and frightened, indignant and angry at the world that he had suddenly turned against him. Mean old things, John thought, blaming Miss Plimsoll and Mrs. Quaver for his failures, even though nothing that had happened to him had been their fault in any way. Horrible old school, he thought, even though he had liked school until that morning. Hateful Susan, he thought, even though he knew at the same time that he was really longing for her to be friendly with him again. Through the window, Mrs. Midas saw John coming up the path. "Hello, John, dear," she called from the living room. "You're home early today. How nice. As a reward, there'll be a piece of chocolate after supper." "I hate it," John shouted. He was crying too hard to say anything else for a moment. When she heard the sound of his voice, Mrs. Midas rushed into the hall. What's the matter, dear?" she asked, putting her arm around John. John twisted away from her grasp, ran past her, and started up the stairs towards his bedroom. "Susan doesn't want me at her birthday party," he said as he went. "I know she doesn't. I don't want to go to her rotten old party anyway." "I don't think you really mean that," Mrs. Midas said. "Besides," she added, and John was halted by the softness of her voice, "Mrs. Buttercup just telephoned to say she was going to drive over herself at 4 o'clock to pick you up." "She did?" John said. "Yes, she did," Mrs. Midas assured him. "So you'd better hurry and get yourself washed and brushed. Your party clothes are laid out on your bed." There were games on the Buttercup's lawns while it was still warm enough outside. Later, the party supper included the birthday cake was going to be served indoors, and there would be a magician and a short movie. John joined in the blind man's buff and grandmother's footsteps and fox and geese, and soon he became more cheerful. He even temporarily forgot about chocolate. Susan looked very pretty. Her yellow curls had been brushed so hard that they looked silkier than ever. She was wearing a big blue ribbon the same color as her eyes. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, a deeper pink than her new party dress. On her feet were dainty little white socks and white shoes with straps that buttoned. Between games, Susan smiled at John and said, "I'm glad you came." They seemed to be on good terms again. Then Mr. Buttercup approached, bringing a bucket of water from the garage. He set it in the middle of the lawn without spilling a single drop. "We're going to duck for apples," Susan whispered to John. "The boys against the girls. You can be captain of the boys' team." The two teams lined up for the race, Susan leading the girls and John the boys. "The idea is this," Mr. Buttercup explained. "When I say go, not yet, John, Susan and John will run to the bucket. There are 12 apples floating in the bucket and 12 people in the race. Using only their teeth, Susan and John will grab their apples and run back to their lines. And as soon as they touch the hands of the number 2 runners in their teams, Dinny and Duncan, Susan and John will go to the end of their lines and Dinny and Duncan will run to the bucket to duck for apples. Do you all understand the way it's going to work? All right. 1 to get ready, 2 to get steady, and 3 to go." Susan bounded ahead like a jackrabbit and had her face deep in the bucket by the time John reached her side and crouched down for his apple. He got his eye on a big red one with its stalk jutting up conveniently for him to grab. He lowered his face, opened his mouth, and lunged. Somehow his nose reached the apple before his teeth did and pushed it below the surface of the water. John's mouth followed the apple down. Then a terrible thing happened. A terrible thing. The clear water in the bucket turned into dark brown, sweet, liquid chocolate. Susan and John immediately pulled their heads up, but it was too late. Their faces were drenched with chocolate syrup. "Oh, Susan!" exclaimed, wiping chocolate out of her eyes. Chocolate syrup dripped all down her dress, all over her delicate, pale pink dress. "Oh," she moaned. John was in the same state. There was chocolate all over his face. There was chocolate on his white shirt front and on his gray flannel shorts. And there was chocolate in his mouth. John said, "Look." Susan was too surprised and angry to speak. For the second time that day, she turned her back on John and ran away from him. Mrs. Buttercup offered to clean John up, but he couldn't bear to stay at the party another minute. He started off at once for home. And there's the picture. Poor John. Careful what you wish for. Kind of what I'm thinking right now. All right, there's 2 more chapters, and I will read them to you soon. Take care. Have a great weekend. Bye.